I'd like to introduce Tom Bowen, who will be speaking to the monthly meeting of Friends of Philadelphia about John Woolman.
I want to start by giving a couple of my sources because I don't want to forget that, and I want to give full credit to resources. One is a book, which it even shows up. And it's a book by a man named Jeffrey Plank, who is a professor now in England, but was at the University of Cincinnati. He's a Swarthmore graduate and then got his doctorate at Princeton. And the book is John Woolman's Path to the Peaceable Kingdom, a Quaker in the British Empire. And that's an important phrase, which I think I'm going to be able to bring out. Now, another book I bought at the John Woolman Memorial when I went there in Mount Holly, and that is a paperback of the journals with major essays, which is very important for reasons I'll tell you, and that's edited by Phillips Moulton. And then I also want to give a great deal of credit to the curator, the director of the John Woolman Memorial, which is in Mount Holly. It is an 18th century home, which allegedly John Woolman's daughter and her husband, Mary and John Comfort, lived in. Now, it is probably not the home that John Woolman built for them, because in their own literature, they describe the house as being built in 1783. He died in 1772, but he did build a house for them, and on probably that same land. And most likely they later lived in this house. And an interesting aside to that is that on their board of directors, this house was acquired in 1915 by interested people who formed a nonprofit corporation to create a memorial. And today on the board of directors, there are two descendants of John Woolman. Now, they may be collateral descendants from his siblings. He was one of 12 children, but one of those persons who's presently on that board of directors has the last name of Woolman. So there is, of course, a lot of local interest in that memorial. And the director, Charles Bruder, was extremely helpful to me and excited about showing me around. It was just open for the public, from March through November, and I made it under the wire, so I didn't have to have a private tour. I just wandered in, and he was very helpful and very informative. So those are my basic sources. Now I have to place John Woolman in context in several ways. John Woolman lived from 1720 to 1772. He did not live into the American Revolution. It was strictly the colonies during his whole life. Now, he lived through the French and Indian War, or as the Europeans knew it, the 7 Years' War, which was from 1754 to 1763, within his lifetime. And a number of his views were shaped by his experience of living through and other Quakers, living through the French and Indian War. Now, John Woolman, his family came to West Jersey with his grandfather, who's also was named John Woolman. His grandfather came with a Quaker group from Gloucestershire in 1678 and settled in Burlington along the Rancocas Creek, where he received a land grant. Now, to put that in perspective, when John Woolman, the grandfather, did that, when he settled in Burlington, George Fox was still alive. The grandfather did it in 1678. George Fox's dates were 1624 to 1691. So at least in this grandfather, it was during George Fox's lifetime. Now, as I said, the grandfather, John Woolman, received a land grant, and he established a working farm, built a frame house first along the Rancocas Creek, and then in 1703, he built a brick house, a more substantial house. His son, Samuel, and Samuel's wife, Elizabeth, also came to live in that same house. They had, as I said, I think it was 12 in total children. I'm not sure all survived. They probably didn't. John Woolman, our subject, was one of 12 children. And this was still a working farm. That's what Samuel, John's father, did. And John, as a boy, worked on the farm. Now, his father, Samuel, had established himself as the second generation. He acquired a library, and what I know from my personal experience from Salem County in New Jersey, a lot of these farmers, and even back in the 18th century, what they did in the winter, often, they read books. And the Woolmans acquired quite a library. Many farmers and Quaker farmers acquired quite a library. And John, as the child, working on the farm, notwithstanding all those siblings, was an introspective child. He read a lot. He thought a lot. He was by himself a lot, according to contemporaries. Now, he studied the scriptures as a child because he, with his family, went to the Burlington meeting. They went to the Burlington meeting. That's where they were. They were in Burlington on the Rancocas Creek. Now, when John reached the age of 20, although it had always been expected that he would be a farmer, he had reached in his introspection a pivotal moment, and he had decided he did not want to be a farmer. And he also, at the same time, had experienced gradually a religious experience, and he wanted to heighten also that religious experience. Now, of course, he had to earn a living. Everybody had to earn a living, and he was no exception. So he decided to separate himself from the family farm, and he moved to Mount Holly. He was 20 years old. He was 20 and the 20 and 21 years of age. It was 1740, 1741. And he started attending the Mount Holly meeting, and which was new to him, but he started attending it very seriously, and he found work working for a tailor. In fact, he became an indentured servant for a period of a year to a tailor. And the tailor had one other indentured servant, but apparently John Woolman was the more trusted, and he was tasked with doing a good bit of the business with the public and also handling money. Now, I have to stop here and talk about both indentured servants and slaves. John Woolman's father, Samuel, may have had a slave. It's not clear as to whether a African-American servant or indentured servant on Samuel Woolman's farm was a slave or not. But I want to point out something about this period in history in both America, in the colonies, and also in Britain, as well as in European countries. Certainly in the colonies, it was very common to have an indentured servant. It was also very common to have one or two slaves. We tend to think of plantations as where slaves were at the time, but slaves were in a individual population of one or two or three, were among all of the population and among a number of the classes of strata of society, because this is almost before the Industrial Revolution, and labor is how people got by. And they often bought labor, and they might do that by an indenture or an indentured servant, or they would own a slave. And the reason why, in fact, I want to go a step further and point out that I once read that in some of these countries, I was reading about France. Every time there would come a major war, another strata or class of society would lose its servants. And actually, the individual blacksmith or the tailor or whatever, or the shopkeeper, often had indentured servants and often had an individual or two slaves. And I want to paint that picture because as we get later in John Woolman's life, he's speaking to a great number of people and Quakers who owned slaves, because a great number of the population if they were above this subsistence level, had hired labor and often had slaves. So we have to put ourselves back into the world as it existed then, and that's what eventually John Woolman was fighting against. Now, John Woolman lived in Mount Holly, and he worked for the tailor, and he fulfilled his indenture contract, and he kept working for the tailor. When the tailor retired, John Woolman didn't take over that shop, but he opened his own shop. Now, the tailor also had a shop, a general store, and the tailor who Woolman worked for. And when John Woolman opened his tailor shop, he also operated a general store, and he sold a number of things. And he sold pork. He sold grain. He sold, well, the tailor had also sold indenture contracts. Now, I don't know that it's not clear that John ever trafficked in indentured contracts. Now, John was already embarked on a spiritual journey and an inward journey. And it can be illustrated in a number of ways. And one is the story about when he was called upon to write a contract for a bill of sale for slavery, for a slave. When he worked for the tailor, he was asked to do that. And he was 21 or in that early 20s. And it is, the historians say that he felt extremely uncomfortable doing that, so much so that he spoke up and told the buyer and the seller of the slave that he thought it was wrong and that they shouldn't do it. But because he was an indentured servant to the tailor, he did perform the duty. Now, that is contrary to the popular story, because what happened is that when he was working for himself a few years later, he was again asked to write a bill of sale for a slave. And at that point, he very gently and with explaining refused to do it. He refused to do it because he was not beholden to the tailor. It wasn't a violation of any indenture contract, and it was his own belief. And that refusal to write a bill of sale is for a slave, which he did repeatedly after that, is often quoted as an early illustration of John Woolman's standing up for his beliefs. Now, at the time, well, let's see. Let me see if I can continue trying to put things in some context here. I want to say an early word about the journal. He didn't start writing the journal till he was 36 years old. That journal was not in existence until 1756, because he says at the beginning of the journal, "I am 36 years old." So that's how we date it. It was never published in his lifetime. It was immediately published after his death, but not during his lifetime. Now, he was widely published by a process that I'm going to describe during his lifetime, but it was essays and not the journal itself. He became very active in the Mount Holly meeting, and he also participated in the Philadelphia yearly meeting. And he became more and more active as the years would go by. And he would not issue any writing, any essay, unless it was approved by the Philadelphia yearly meeting. No essay. And the reason has to do with the common procedure in the 18th century, and also his own belief. He had come to believe through a lifetime already of study and reflection that the unity of the meeting had to be expressed even in your everyday life and at all times. And, on reflection, when I was reading through this, this was not the age of the individual. There was the Philadelphia yearly meeting had a publication committee, which was also called the Overseers of the Press. And that committee, which John Woolman later served on, would review and edit and modify the writings of its members before the members distributed them wherever among their friends or published them otherwise. And John Woolman never issued an essay or disseminated any printing without it being reviewed by the meeting. And the overseers of the press, so to speak, and the publication committee were really, busy folks. And John Woolman, probably more than most, felt that he did not have a right to express an opinion or a position that would diverge from the unity or collective opinion of the meeting, of the yearly meeting. And therefore, he would try to change them if he felt compelled to do so. But if he was unable to bring them to his point of view, he wouldn't express the point of view. Now, this led me to believe that, again, this is a different world we're talking about, although it is very much Quakerism in its essence. And I was also thinking that, the concept of the individual kind of rose up in the 1500s, in the 16th century, in Italy and in the Renaissance. But really, in his time, in the 17th century, particularly in Quakers, the individual did not have there was not that concept. And John Woolman was remarkable because he carried that out so skillfully and so completely. Now, there's some interesting history that illustrates that. As I said, the French and Indian War occurred during this period when he was young and mature. And Quakers had a variety of views, but eventually, having adopted a peace testimony and also being unhappy at the way the Native Americans were being treated, more and more the Quakers came to be against the French and Indian War, and of course against war in general. Now, John Woolman submitted an essay to the overseers of the press, which was a peace testimony, and which provided that a Quaker should not pay taxes if those taxes were supporting the French and Indian War. These were colonies, after all, so we're talking really about British taxes. And the Philadelphia yearly meeting wouldn't go that far and would not approve his essay for publication. And he was also, what he was trying to do at the time was get the meeting to issue an epistle of that being its position, that it would not pay taxes that were supporting the French and Indian War. And the meeting, the Philadelphia yearly meeting, was split and was in a heated discussion of this for at least a year or more. And they finally issued an epistle from the yearly meeting, which was their position to the world. And that was that a member of the meeting should not hold any office which would persecute or enforce prosecution of any Quaker who didn't pay the taxes. So if you can follow that convoluted statement, that's as far as the Philadelphia yearly meeting would go at the time. And John Woolman did not get publication of his proposed essay at that time. Now, he tried again several years later, and he was able to succeed at that time. So there was always an evolution of opinion taking place. Now, there's another very important concept that I have to tell about John Woolman's thinking. And John Woolman, even though his journal was never read during his lifetime, never published, he wrote a great deal and he published a great deal, and the yearly meeting overseers of the press approved a great deal, and he worked on that committee of approving others. So he was a well-read man and a considerable writer. Now, what he was doing throughout this period, he was thinking of what his core beliefs were. And one of the very core beliefs was any life lived more than on a very simple level deprived others of their sustenance and livelihood. Any life that anyone who consumed more than was bare necessity was depriving other members of society in general of their sustenance, and was also, if you had a silver coffee pot, I've heard this example discussed before, but if you had a silver coffee pot instead of a plain clay or ceramic one, then others had to live and work under harsh conditions to give you a superfluity that did accomplish nothing but, of course, inflate your vanity, and also inflict them to harder labor for some kind of an overseer. And the more he thought about different products, the more he saw that consuming was wrong. Consuming beyond what was necessary. And that in later life, of course, he died when he was 52. But in later life, as we know and have often heard, he would adapt the plain Quaker dress even more by omitting collars and buttons, which Quaker dress had, even though Quaker dress didn't have the ruffles and the finery that non-Quaker dress did. But he would modify it even further. Now, I need to talk, of course, about his position on slavery, but this is really a segue into that, because his anti-slavery position is what John Woolman is most known for. And in his belief in complete equality among all humans and all beings, really, it didn't take long for him to be indeed affronted by slavery. As I said earlier, slavery was very widespread, even among Quakers, very, very widespread. And so that he, at a point I'll now talk about in his life, when he was about 36 and began to write his journal, he also had become known to the yearly meeting as a minister. Now, this took me aback for a while because, I thought, well, Quakers don't have ministers. But he was one of many ministers, because ministers, and they were approved or certified by the yearly meeting as being ministers. But what did that mean? That didn't mean anything that they would do in the meeting, because it didn't apply to that. It meant that they would go out and do ministry. First of all, to members of the meeting itself. For example, if a member of the meeting had become a drunkard then sometimes 2 or 3 so-called ministers would do a ministry. They were just members of the yearly meeting, and they would do a ministry at that person to gently try to help that person. Now, interestingly, in my reading, they would also do it in the case of marital trouble. If it became widely known to the yearly meeting that a couple was having terribly serious marital trouble, there would be ministries to that couple to try to heal that. And John Woolman, at that time, that's that 1756 time, about the time of starting to write the journal, he began to do ministries, often with other members, a single other member of the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, to other meetings in Pennsylvania and then further afield to minister against the holding of slaves. And he would do that. He did that over a period of years, and he was often by himself when he did that. And as we know, he went down into Virginia and Maryland and even North Carolina, and he went up into New England. And it was those journeys, those ministries were principally on the problem of slavery, to talk to meetings and individuals and try to persuade them to give up owning slaves. And another common story is told that he would try to increasingly distance his own conduct from any support of slavery. And for example, when he went, let's say, to Maryland, and a Quaker slave owner would entertain him, he would he would try to get the slave owner to accept pay from Woolman for the hospitality, so that he wasn't receiving hospitality that was based on slavery. And he would try to get the slave owner to give that money from Woolman to the slave. And if he didn't trust the Quaker slave owner, or if he didn't otherwise think it would happen, he would give the money directly to the slave, presumably discreetly, I don't know. This is also a common story about John Woolman and how he would increasingly reflect and try to distance himself in every way possible from any connection with slavery or any support of slavery. And the more he thought about it, the more the connections were there. Now, John Woolman was supporting himself by being a tailor, and he was also running a store and selling food, goods, and other goods. And there came a time about this same period of time in the 1750s, the middle 1750s, when he stopped selling pork because he found out that pork was often shipped to the Caribbean to support or to feed the plantations that were that had a huge number of slaves. And it's not that he didn't want to feed the slaves; he didn't want to support the plantations. Now, he didn't say why he was stopping selling pork, so we can only suppose that that was the reason. What is known is he stopped selling pork, and he stopped selling other things that he thought either would interfere with his own simple life or that would support in any way slavery. Now, he increasingly would make these ministries, and he decided to go to England because he had always believed that the early Quakers in England in the 17th century, his grandfather's time, had a simpler and purer form of Quakerism than the Quakers in John Woolman's own time. And he wanted to connect with what he thought was a purer and simpler form of Quakerism that he thought still existed in England from the carryover from the 17th century, from the 1600s. Now, he thought that because the Quakers who came from England to the colonies were of that type, and they were on ministries themselves. So he thought that all English Quakers were like the ones he met who came from England, but of course they were not. And interestingly, the English Quakers who were familiar with people like John Woolman, who made ministries to England, they thought that the American Quakers were purer and simpler, and they made the same mistake. Now, the reason why it's important to talk about that is because after the French and during and after the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, the British Empire in the colonies and all over the world was riding high and becoming richer and more interconnected and more industrial. And it was producing more finery. It was making people richer, a certain part of the population, all during and after the French and Indian War. It's maritime, as we all know. The Navy and the maritime industry of Great Britain was starting to really rise, and they were relying heavily on the Caribbean and on slaves and on sugar and on rum. And indirectly, in many cases, Philadelphia Quakers and Burlington Quakers were becoming, like people throughout the British Empire, more and more prosperous. And Quakers started buying those silver coffee pots for their table, even though they continued to be Quakers. And this was the atmosphere that occurred in the 18th century leading up to the American Revolution, that John Woolman was rowing against the tide and was trying to, as best he could by testimony, undo. Now, increasingly, he relied on the testimony of not words, nonverbal, of how he lived and what you saw of John Woolman rather than his spoken words. And that is why eventually he refused to have anything to do with dyed cloth and wore undyed white, but not pure white, clothing only. He wanted to advertise himself and hold himself as an example of rebellion against exploitation and, of course, slavery. And so he would do it more and more by example. And when he did go to England, for example, he first found a Quaker ship owner who he thought was a little less involved in the maritime exploitation, although I don't think he could determine that. But he also decided to board to England with the mariners in the steerage, with the sailors. And he was appalled by the sailors' behavior. But he was also appalled by how they were treated and how they had to live on ship. But that's how he went to England, and it weakened his health. And he got to London, and he was appalled by what he saw of the dye industry, and he thought that was exploitation of all its workers. And he was glad that he was free of that. He was appalled by English industrial urban life. And he became more and more an agrarian, a belief in the life of the farm and the life of the countryside. He decided to walk to York, where he was going to meet with the simple Quakers who he felt were there. And he, over a 3-month period, he did walk from London to York. Now, I've been to York. I know how far York is from London. It's very far. And I'm sure he had hospitality along the way, but he did walk, and it further weakened him. I'm sure his diet was not good. And in York, he became ill. We're now at 1772. I'm going to backtrack in a minute, but I've skipped over something, but I'll go back to it. But we're now in 1772. He became ill, and what he became ill was he had contracted smallpox. And he had contracted smallpox because he had refused in his lifetime inoculation. Because he did write about that, or he is quoted as in Jeffrey Plank's book as writing that smallpox was created by the Creator, and so he would not interfere with it by being inoculated. He died of it. He died of smallpox in York, not terribly long after he got there. Now, he lingered for a while, and he wrote in a bequest type a letter that he wanted his clothes sold, and the resulting money would pay the expense of his burial. Now that's going to take me back. He had a wife and one living child who he had left behind, Sarah and Mary. Mary lived in that farmhouse that is related, but not built by John Woolman. That is the Woolman Memorial in Mount Holly. Now he had married, I think I mentioned that, Sarah, shortly after he had moved to Mount Holly, and she outlived him. She lived into the American Revolution, and she was a member of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. Now, he had made provision for her. They had a shop with lodgings over the shop, which he had bought early in his Mount Holly trade experience. And that's where they lived. And he had built in 1771 a house for his daughter Mary and her husband John Comfort. He had, to that extent, made provision, but he was trying in the last 15 or 20 years of his life to separate himself in every way from commerce. So he was not a wealthy man at all, although he did leave his wife Sarah a place to live. Now, I think, well, I want to round off by telling you about the house. The house is a lovely experience and could be an outing, especially in the spring and the summer. Although the leaflets that I brought with me say the house was built in 1783 on land that Mary and her husband already owned. So that I'm not sure that they have ever identified the house that John Woolman built for her and her husband. This is not it, or this is certainly not it. They're not 100% sure that she ever lived in this house, but they're reasonably sure, and circumstantial evidence points to this being the house. It is an ongoing memorial. Now, I want to finish up by saying that after John Woolman's death, immediately the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting edited his journal, but they didn't make many emendations to it. They largely published it as it was. The London Yearly Meeting, a year later, edited it again for their publication of it, and they amended it big time, because in his journal he had become very critical of the Quakers living in England at the time as having strayed so much from the 17th century English Quakers, and also from the way the maritime industry in Britain was subjugating half the world and most of the population. So the British, the London Yearly Meeting edited considerably his journal, and then they published it. John Woolman became far more famous in America in the 19th century than he ever was in the 18th century, because the Quaker poet before the Civil War, John Greenleaf Whittier, started writing about John Woolman as being the principal anti-slavery proponent in the colonies. And he wrote about him so widely and emphasized so much that John Woolman was overwhelmingly effective with Quakers in establishing an anti-slavery belief, that John Woolman soon became more popular in the 1860s and in the 1870s. It began in 1847 than he ever was in the 1700s. So that John Greenleaf Whittier, who was also a Quaker, spread the renown of John Woolman far and wide. Samuel Coleridge Taylor in England also then took up the mantle to promote John Woolman. And that's how we know him today. End of talk. Questions?
Sure. My understanding was that George Fox became famous by saying that each of us has a direct contact with source. And what you're saying is completely opposite to that, that
Yes.
It had to be a group agreement as opposed to an individual contact.
Wow. It did at that time. I mean, it's clear because there was a very active, and you see, John Woolman was especially espousing of this, probably more than many others. He deeply believed in the beliefs and the thought of the group, not the individual. He deeply believed that.
And since you've said that he didn't believe people should have fancy stuff like a silver coffee pot, why on earth did he run a tailor shop and a grocery store and a legal business?
Because John Woolman was constantly evolving, and he was the John Woolman that we're talking about grew from a seed through all of this experience in the world, and so we see the end product. I see. But this end product came very gradually throughout his life. And through he was one of those persons who didn't start out finished. He started out as a work in progress, and he refined and refined and refined his work in progress, which was himself, through the years and through the decades.
So when he was younger and running 3 businesses, he would have bought himself a silver coffee pot?
No, I don't say that, because he was from childhood a believer in simplicity. I'm only referring to the times that he was dealing with, and the Quaker times he was dealing with. But he would not have done that.
Right. See, Irish Quakers were very much making linen, and linen could be pretty fancy too. I mean, and look at the Quakers in England, Cadbury's and Fry's. They were making chocolate. I mean, it's not that Quakers weren't involved in doing things that were what. So do you have any insight into why he wouldn't vaccinate himself against smallpox?
No. And there's only a reference to that one sentence that Jeffrey Plank found in his writings that he wrote.
Now, the smallpox thing was very controversial. A lot of people were angry with Cotton Mather for advocating getting your kids vaccinated. People actually said to him, if God wants my kid to die, that's God's choice. I shouldn't do anything.
Yeah.
I mean, people were mad at Cotton Mather, a religious leader, for telling them to vaccinate their children.
You know, I was constantly thinking to myself that I'm living in a completely different world when I'm looking back on John Woolman's life. And I was trying in as many ways to recreate the world that he was dealing with, which was quite different from ours.
But what would he do with all that money? I mean, the man ran 3 businesses. Why do that if you have nothing to do with the money?
Well, I'm sure he gave it here and there. I mean, he used it. And also, you know, a lot of the time he wasn't working because he was on the road with the ministries.
Yeah.
And he wasn't employing underlings because he didn't believe in that. He did now and then, but he did it as little as possible.
And he thought that, say, Paul Revere, who made his living by selling things made of silver, was somehow bad.
Probably. Yeah, there's an interesting anecdote about there was a Quaker woman named Elizabeth Smith. I think there's a very famous martyr, but this wasn't her. This was somebody in West Jersey, and she was a very respected Quaker woman, but she had a table with a carving on it. And he criticized her mercilessly for acquiring a table with a carving on it, you know, like a shell of shell shape or a turning, because someone had to suffer through their employment hardship to make that so that she could have it. And she was a respected Quaker lady. And then there's a picture in the book of a table that one of his brothers owned that still exists, with turned legs that he would not have liked.
So if you're an artist and you choose to make a work of art, he would think that was somehow wrong?
I don't know. It's difficult for me to speak for John Woolman.
Did you come up with any really great quotes from the journal that you particularly liked?
Yeah, that's too big an assignment.
Okay, all right, I get it. No sound bites.
I'll send you a reprint of this book. This booklet that's just a little photo. It says John Woolman Speaks. Okay. And it has all of that as his pithy pronouncements.
I see. Okay.
Does it have that quote about why he wouldn't wear buttons and collars? That sounds fascinating.
How did he keep his clothes up?
There was
falling off.
There's some crazy way that he and others had to do that.
He was a tailor. He had any trouble.
Yeah, he was a tailor.
Right.
And you know, to further shock Lois, in the early days of his store, he sold rum. But of course, he stopped selling rum or having anything to do with sugar because he realized how horrific the Caribbean slave use was in Barbados and the other Caribbean countries. So he distanced himself from rum. But first he sold it, and then he stopped selling.
So it sounds to me like he was very, very, very much focused on stopping slavery. I mean, that was the key, right?
Yeah. Yes. And he was very introspective and self-examining through the years.
Yeah.
Tom, I'm curious as to where he was in the birth order among his siblings. Do you recall?
Yeah, I think he was he was either, I think he was the oldest, and certainly the oldest son. Now, interestingly, I already knew this. You know, Quakers didn't, and maybe I don't know what they do now, but didn't practice in those days of the British Empire. Quakers didn't practice primogeniture.
Right.
So he was never going to inherit the whole farm. It was going to be divided up, and he did inherit a piece of land, but later, you know, when his father had died. But it would have been an equal part with however many children were living at that time. I believe he was named after his grandfather, but I think he was the oldest son.
Would he have known Benjamin Franklin? Now, of course, Benjamin Franklin was not a Quaker, but
he used Benjamin Franklin. Here's what he would do. He used his printing house, because what he would do is he got an essay approved by the overseers of the press in the yearly meeting, but the yearly meeting would often then pay for the printing costs of whoever was they were approving. But he would not accept in this particular case, which was not to not support the war, he would not let the Philadelphia yearly meeting print or pay for the very thing they had approved. And he went to, and I'll tell you why in a minute, he went to Benjamin Franklin's printing shop and at his own expense had it printed there. And the reason why I'm told in Jeffrey Plank's book is that there were Quakers who were contributing to the yearly meeting, who were paying their taxes, probably most, to the British, and therefore supporting the war. And he didn't want the yearly meeting, their money, to be paying for his tract against supporting the war. So he assumed the printing under his own expense, and he went to Ben Franklin. And of course, Ben Franklin would take money. That's what he did.
I've just been reading about Benjamin Franklin. He was never there. I mean, he was in England. No. I mean, he was quite an operator. Which
he spent 9 years in England. This is in the colonial period. 9 straight years.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because you know, I walked past his grave and he's buried next to Deborah. Apparently, he never married Deborah. Deborah was
I know,
was married to someone else, and he wasn't even around. I mean, he just, you know, he was hardly ever there.
She had her hands full, though, didn't she? Because she was back here.
She really did. It's quite amazing. So here's this grave of this domestic couple that looked, you know, like so connected, and then you read about them and it wasn't like that at all. But it sounds like John Woolman had a pretty complicated marriage too.
He did. I think he did have a complicated marriage. And you know what is very interesting to me? John Woolman was fighting a system that is not unlike the times we live in. He was fighting an ever-growing British Empire, which knowingly or unknowingly, knowingly and unknowingly, was was spreading a lot of ills and inequality. And he was right in the middle of that and trying to find ways to fight it and to find personal integrity. You know, I mean, to me, it's very transferable to our own times, our own lifetimes.
Yeah.
Now, full disclosure, I was a captain in the Vietnam War. So believe what I say, not what I do.
Wow. Were you really?
Yeah, I was.
Wow.
Well, I have to say that because it happens to be fact.
We honor you at the ACES Museum. We honor every veteran. We'll have to give you a medal.
I have a medal. Thank you. I even accepted it.
All right.
Tom,
So you're a work in progress.
Yeah, I'm a work in progress.
Solving, right.
Give me another 20 years. Another 20 years, I'll be a good Quaker. I'll also be 99 years old. But go ahead.
There you go.
Yeah,
Yes.
Tom, so one question. I had understood that that Woolman's greatest contribution, or the way in which he was most successful in the anti-slavery fight, was to try to convince individual Quakers, and that he visited individuals. And is that also what you found?
It is what I found, because it was said by others that, he had this increasing reputation that he often was successful and in getting Quakers to stop owning slaves. And he was often successful in unexpected places, like, for example, Maryland, and it was because he didn't, even though he later was an outrageous dresser or demonstrative, he didn't make any frontal attacks on these slave owners. And he always, he respected everybody, no matter what inequities he saw them doing. He still respected them. And I think they felt that. So that in a number of cases, he was successful. And, those of us who have looked at Rachel Davis, who has worked with the Quaker method of persuasion. He was an early expert at a Quaker method of persuasion, apparently. And often he wasn't successful too.
From what my textbooks said, only about 4% of people in the South owned slaves. So when you say slavery was common among Quakers, what percent are we talking about?
I have no idea. But it was without, it may be in some of this material, but it was widespread in Burlington County and in Philadelphia, where he primarily operated.
So you're saying more than 4%?
I don't know what this 4% is. I've discovered I'm related to one person in Louisiana, and he owned. All I can say is I'm related to the people he owned. So I don't know. I think I don't know what 4% means. 4% of people, in which you have big families. So you have a family and you have a couple of slaves and you have 15 children.
Yeah, my great grandfather, my great grandparents, my great grandfather, who lived in Salem, was a doctor. In the third floor of his house were the quarters for the servants, a black man and woman, husband and wife, who worked inside or outside the house. He died, my great-grandfather died in 1917 in the flu epidemic. And they were living there at that time. He was paying them $4 a month plus room and board. And I don't know, his father had been a Quaker farmer. He was Quaker. His father had been a Quaker farmer in Salem County who gave my great-grandfather this big house. Whether that father had slaves is unknown to me. But the fact that there were this black couple living, a couple who lived in the attic of my great-grandfather's house leads me to suspect that maybe his father, his Quaker father, had slaves.
Yeah. Wow.
Salem County. Salem County.
There's a Griffith Morgan house in Pennsauken, and he was a well-known Quaker, and he had slaves. There's he willed the humans he owned on whoever it was who inherited.
I suspect
there were plenty.
Yeah, I suspect it was more than 4%.
I don't know what 4% means. 4% of the population.
4% of Quakers.
White men. 4% of.
Yeah.
I think it was much more. In fact, this relative that I found in Louisiana, he was actually given this young girl by his Quaker mother-in-law and parents-in-law. He was actually given her. And and he married this was in about 1820 when he got married. So, you know, I think it's a huge stain.
Yeah.
On it.
And, John Woolman was a pioneer. He was bringing civilization 10 steps forward.
Yeah.
So you know, we have to give him credit.
Yeah. Isn't that great that people rise up?
Yeah.
When everyone else, I think well, really, I mean, we're not very good on climate.
Well, and you know, John Woolman's genius, as we've said in a number of different ways, is he looked around and saw that great wrong and a lot of things wrong, and he found ways to persuade people to make change.
He really was like the #1 person that everyone was following.
No.
In the anti-slavery movement?
I don't think so. I think John Greenleaf Whittier promoted that. You know, there was a man, you may have known of him, Benezet. There was a man named Benezet who was who at the time in the middle of the 1700s in the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting was as active in anti-slavery as Woolman was.
That was that short person? Was he the short person?
I don't know.
Money was given to our meeting as a scholarship to honor Benezet, and that's the money that just went to St. Joseph's.
Benezet was very important.
Lovely.
He started a school in Philadelphia for poor Black children, and he started the idea that not only did they need books, they needed clothing. And that's what the St. Joseph's does as well. And the money given in his name to our meeting to find similar poor Black children who need clothing so they can go to school is money that we gave to St. Joseph's, where they do give kids clothing so they can go to school.
Yeah. Benezet was very important.
Mm-hmm.
And is still important.
Yeah.
Isn't that fabulous?
Well, so are you, Suzanne.
People to this day. Isn't that fabulous?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. I see what you mean. Yeah. Because of St. Joseph's.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh.
Well, do you want to give us some final words about John Woolman, and then I'll end the recording?
I don't want to give some final words about John Woolman. I'll thank you very much for this opportunity to undertake this study, which has improved my life.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.